Let me begin by talking about the title of the talk today, European Foundations of the Caste System. The title probably will sound very counterintuitive. When we talk about caste system, we generally talk about a system which is very unique to India, something which originated in the Vedic past, something which is so distinctively marker of Indian tradition, Indian culture. And here is a title that says European Foundations of the Talk. European Foundations of the Caste System. This is a slightly modified title of a book that some of us co-edited last year. That book was called Western Foundations of the Caste System. And to understand what do we mean by Western or European foundations of the caste system, we have to go through a whole lot of ideas, a framework to understand these things, and what is it that we are trying to get at. So let me give a couple of clarifications before I venture into the theme of the talk. First is, what is it that we are saying, and secondly, what is it that we are not saying. Often our critiques attribute to us the statements like, we say that there is no caste atrocities in India, that we say that there are no jatis in India. And when I say we here, I am talking about a group of researchers working with and around the research tradition of S.N. Balangadhara. He has worked for about 4 decades on various issues, one of them is caste system. So many of us, when we say that there is no caste in India, though that's an abbreviated way of saying there is no caste system in India. What we are not saying is that there are no atrocities in India. No, we are not saying that. That there are no jatis in India, we are not saying that. No matter how desirable a situation this is, that there shouldn't be atrocities. There are no societies in the world that has no atrocities. There are atrocities and there are problems everywhere in the world, including India. Indian communities also fight, they reconcile, they are like normal human beings. So we are not saying that there are no atrocities, no problems, no fights, no reconciliations in India. So we are also not saying that there are no jatis in India. See, jatis are, if you like, something like cities of Bangalore, there's Ahmedabad, there's Bangkok, there's London. To say that there are no jatis like Brahmins and Lingayats or Reddis or Kammas is like saying there are no Bhadravatis, no Bangalores, and there are no Kolkatas. You cannot say that. That is nonsense actually. So we are not making any nonsense statement when we say there are no caste, there is no caste system in India, or when we are saying that there is no caste atrocities to talk about in India. So what are we saying then? See, that's a very complex question. We are saying many things when we say this thing, and I will want to walk you through many different steps before you can understand. A short answer to say that there is no caste system in India, or to say that caste system is a structure in the European experience of India, will not make sense unless I set stage for you to understand what do we mean by these statements. To understand what one says about caste system, how the scholars are using the word caste system, the phrase caste system, try and ask these questions to yourself. On the one hand, the statements like, there is a caste system in India, Indian society is based on caste system, Indian social structure is caste, or caste system is how Indian society, traditions, culture is built. These statements look perfectly normal to us. They look like anybody can make these statements, and we all keep on making it. But do we understand these statements? Make these kind of statements and see. If I say the German society is based on some system, what system? Is American society based on some kind of social structure which is Christian or church? The statement that American, German or French or European society is based on something, or their social structure is based on some particular religion or institution, doesn't make sense to us at all. So when we talk about India, why does it make sense to us that Indian social structure is caste system? We don't even understand this statement. What do we mean by that? See, if Indian social system is based on caste, or Indian social structure is caste system in itself, then every single thing in India that happened in the past, that will happen in the future, all based on caste system. That must be very ridiculous to make a statement. No, that statement is. There are another set of questions that you can ask. See, today, whether it's UN or UK or EU parliaments, they're all talking about caste. UK, for example, is asking India consistently to pass laws against caste system. They keep saying we have not have passed enough laws against caste system. They all want us to fight against caste system. Try to understand what's happening here. We have had a lot of anti-caste laws. It's not the laws that is an issue. So what are they saying? There are only two options for us to think about it. Either the UN, UK, EU, everybody is anti-India, and many of us are happy to say that, or they think of caste system in a different way. They think of it as something very deeply ugly, inhuman, bad, and somehow Indians are not able to understand it, yet they are practicing it. Therefore, becomes their moral duty, becomes their humanitarian concern to tell us that no, do this, do that. It's a kind of, in some sense, at least in one sense, it's a kind of friendly suggestions that the Europe and UK keeps giving us. So what is that we Indians have to understand in here is this: if European Union or UK or UN are not anti-India, then why are they making these statements? What does this statement mean to them? There is only one possibility. They think that all Indians somehow, whether they know it or they don't know it, are practicing and are responsible for the existence of the caste system. That is what Europe and the West thinks about us. So when we say there is no caste system, whole lot of responses that we receive are of the kind, no, you see in my village, there are so many of these things that happen. There are Jats here, there are Brahmins here. One day this happened, one Jat boy was beaten up. So I got a job for a Jat boy, and then a Brahmin family came and asked me for a better job than the Jat boy got. So these kind of responses that the Indians give when we talk about that India has no caste system tells us two things. One, Indians are incapable of understanding what the West is saying about caste system at all. When they say Indians are not fighting against caste system, they are not talking about these small issues of somebody getting a job, somebody getting a scholarship, etc. They are talking about an entire society, an entire system based on caste. So that is why before we even begin to understand what this caste system is, what we should do with it, we should try to understand what the West is saying about caste system, what they're saying that Indian society is based on caste structure. So the Indian social structure is caste based, these things. I'll give you one example. See, there is this very popular book by Nicholas Dirks called Caste of Mind, and the very first paragraph that he begins with, it's not clear when you read the first paragraph what he is saying, because he just quotes from many different authors. He says this is what the entire world is saying about India. But 2 pages later he says, after the colonialism, during the colonialism, something happened and all these things have become reality. And I'll read out some of the lines. I'll leave out some words and I'll just pick some words. I'm not adding any words to it. And here is what he is saying about Indian society. When thinking of India, it is hard not to think of caste. Caste has become a central symbol for India, indexing it as fundamentally different from other places as well as expressing its essence. Caste is the basic form of Indian society. Caste defines the core of Indian tradition and the major threat to Indian modernity. If we are to understand India properly and Hinduism, we must understand caste. It is we as Indians, I am saying, don't understand what Dirks is saying here at all. If you don't believe me, just change the word India and caste into like US or Europe and add Christianity and church to it and see how absurd it looks. It will read like something like, church is the basic form of American society. Church defines the core of European tradition. Do they make sense? They don't make sense. But why do we feel as though we as the Indian intellectuals, the educated Indian groups, go around believe that we understand caste system, we think we know what caste system means, and bring in so many measures to fight it, so many measures to deal with it? On the one hand, there's a very basic consensus that everybody agrees with. Everybody, as like all intellectuals, everybody who's written about it in the last 200 years, very firmly believe in it, that there is a caste system in India, that it is deeply immoral, that it has persisted over the centuries despite all kinds of fight that the human beings have waged against it, whether it's Ambedkar, whether it is Buddha or Gandhi, everybody. On the other hand, if you start digging a little bit, you will realize that there are no consensus on even the most fundamental issues related to caste system. How is caste related to violence in India? What is caste as a system to do with Indian society? How can caste perpetuate and come into existence about 3000 years ago when there was no WhatsApps or Facebook or anything? Somebody invented it in Kashmir or somewhere in Afghanistan, and it spread down to what? Today's Karnataka, Kerala, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and see, there are no answers to any of these questions today. Take another example. It's extremely normal for a physics student to draw a timeline of the progress that we have made as intellectuals in the way we have understood any fundamental concept of physics, let's say sun or gravity or light or mass or anything. Just go and do it. Go to your school, go to your college, pick up a serious student and ask him to draw a timeline of the way we have understood sun over the decades. And he will tell you, just by looking at the Wikipedias or some encyclopedia, he will tell you that in the 1840s we were thinking that the energy in the sun, SUN sun, has to do with the way meteoroids fall there and meteoroids work there. 10 years later they were saying all the energy and heat in sun has to do with the gravitational contract. It took us about 65-70 years to tell us that, to find out that the heat and energy in sun has to do with nuclear reaction at the core of the sun. Ask any serious caste scholar, whether Indian or non-Indian, to make a similar timeline of the progress that we have done with any fundamental concept of caste system, whether it is endogamy or hierarchy or commensality or anything. Can we say what we were thinking about endogamy in 1850s, 25 years later, and how did we change, our ideas change, 100 years later, are we saying something new about it? And I asked a similar question to a very important caste scholar about 2 years ago in an international conference. He had just finished presenting a longish paper on the progress in caste scholarship of 150 years. He heard my question and simply called it a stupid question to say. It shows how vacuous the field of caste studies today is. We cannot make a simple chart, a timeline of what we have done over 150 years. Every single thing, believe it or not, that we are saying about caste system today in the 21st century has already been said, and said in probably much better way in the 19th century by European scholars. So what have Indians done then? What have Indian scholars contributed to the field then in the last 150 years? It's a question for us to think. The question then is, why so many confusions? How have we arrived at this situation? What happened to us? See, I cannot in this talk go on giving you more and more examples to show how vacuous the field of caste system studies is, how empty it is, what the kind of thing that we are saying which has absolutely no proof or any kind of empirical evidence. But one important example for you. Let's talk about endogamy. What do we mean by endogamy today? Endogamy is an in-marrying group. A group, when it marries within itself, it's endogamy. And endogamy has been talked about as one of the most fundamental aspect of caste system. For example, Ambedkar says it is the essence of caste system. So there are many scholars who talk about endogamy as the fundamental property of caste system. But one of the biggest problems that we face when we go to the field with this idea is that we don't know what is the unit which is endogamous. See, I was part of a research group in Karnataka in Coimbatore University. The center was called CSLC, Center for Study of Local Cultures. They did a mammoth fieldwork for about 8 years under the guidance of S.N. Balagangadhara. And one of the things that we found out when we went there to the field with these kind of ideas about endogamy is that we don't know who is endogamous, which group is endogamous. Take the example of Kurubas of Karnataka. It's a dominant caste in Karnataka. Kuruba is one caste, but it has many subcastes. There are Sanna Kuruba, Dodda Kuruba, Halu Kuruba, Jainu Kuruba. And it is not Kurubas who marry within themselves. It is the smaller units that marry within themselves. A Sanna Kuruba will not marry a Dodda Kuruba. A Halu Kuruba will not marry a Jainu Kuruba. Now, who is endogamous here? Guriye, for example, important caste scholar says, because of these kind of problems, no, we should take subcaste as the real unit of caste system and not the caste itself. Okay, but that doesn't solve the problem. If we take a subcaste as a real unit of caste, what happens to the caste then? How do the small castes come together and form a bigger caste, a caste? And the problem becomes even more complicated if you do start doing your fieldwork among Brahmin communities. Brahmin is considered always one caste, and the statements like Brahmin is a caste and caste is an endogamous group is a part of almost all our textbooks. But go to the field, there is no Brahmin caste. There are many different castes within Brahminism. Take Iyengars for example. Iyengar is not just one caste. Iyengar has many sub-castes again, Vadakali and Tenkali for example. So now, ask this question, a Vadakali boy goes in search of a girl, who is he marrying? Surely he wants a Vadakali girl, but Vadakali has to be a Iyengar, that Iyengar has to be a Brahmin. So now who is endogamous group here? Brahmins, Iyengars, Vadakali group? The problem is not even solved at that level because there is something called Gotra among Brahmins. Now, a Brahmin, Iyengar, Vadakali boy will not marry a Brahmin, Iyengar, Vadakali girl if she belongs to the same Gotras. So, who is endogamous group finally? Is it Brahmin, Iyengar, Vadakali or some Gotras? So, these are the kind of confusions. But don't get confused. This is not very academic issue. I am not talking about academic confusions in caste studies. There is much more than that. This is just a way of introducing the topic for you. See, recently in 2018, Supreme Court in one of its cases declared that endogamy is not essential property of caste. But about 10 years ago in 2006, it had declared in another case, no, endogamy and marriage is a central issue of caste, therefore government of India should pay attention to or promote intercaste marriages, and a whole lot of money is poured into it. So it's one bad theory in caste system today is costing us enormous amount of money. Just go and do your own research and you will see how much money Indian government is pouring into promoting intercaste marriage, and ask why are they doing it. And if that example is not sufficient for you, I'll give you an even more important example. You must have heard about Babri Devi case. I keep talking about it always in my class. I won't give you many details, but you all know what happened. So Babri Devi was gang raped by about 5 so-called upper caste men, and the judge asked simple question, how can upper caste men touch a lower caste woman? This rape never took place. Ask yourself, who created these lines that upper caste men don't touch lower caste women, that there is untouchability, that it is part of caste, and who is it finally, who is paying the price for it? Not the upper caste in some sense, no. It is the lower caste people who are paying price for this faulty theories of caste system. I'll give an example from my own state. In 2000, in Karnataka, in a small village called Kambalapalli in Kolar district. 11 SC boys were killed. Who killed it, what and how it happened, that is not for us for now. So that there are other agencies who will take care of it. But there is one important issue that I want to bring to your notice. And after the mass murder of about 11 SC youths, people started fleeing from the village. One after another, the entire village was deserted, and suddenly the government woke up, the Karnataka government, and they made an alternative arrangement. So what did they do? They created a small village, some 22 kilometers from where the original village was, and small shack-like houses were built there, and was offered to the people of the village. You must have seen this village. You must have seen the photos of the village. Or if not, you go back and check. Even the dogs will not live in those small shacks. Those are the kind of shacks that they created for people in the village. No post office, no roads, no police stations, no grocery shops, nothing. And why did this happen? The government had set up some fact-finding committee, and there were many independent fact-finding committees. They went to this village, saw what was happening there. The mass murder had happened. And the report that they wrote, which is available online here and there, snippets from it, they said, this caste system is deeply entrenched, it cannot be solved, people from Buddha down to Gandhi have been fighting against, it is part of a culture. These are the kind of things that they wrote. Ask yourself, if this is what caste system is, there is no way you're going to solve it. The only solution you will do is create this kind of some kind of small shacks 22 kilometers away from a village and offer it to the village people. Often when I tell this incident to my students in my class, in my workshops, etc., I do a small exercise. I tell them, imagine in your own village, some 10 people have been killed. Let's not worry about what is their caste, who is the victim, etc. What would you do if you are police persons, if you are teachers, if you are statesmen sitting in that village? They take about 1.5 minutes to say that no, first we should punish the people who have done it, we should conduct a speedy investigation, we should provide some kind of compensation to people who have been affected so that they will feel secure, so that their life is not disturbed too much. This is the kind of suggestion they come up with 1.5 minutes. But the intellectuals who went there, wrote lengthy fact-finding reports, they come up with these kind of ideas. The caste system is deeply entrenched, it's part of a culture, we cannot solve it. People from Buddha to Basavanna to Gandhi have been fighting against it. So today the confusions are not just academic about the caste system. The faulty idea of caste system has penetrated too deeply into our life. The mistakes that the state makes, the mistakes that the court makes, the mistakes that the administration is making because of these faulty theories, we are on the course to pay a heavy price for it. Maybe you and I will not be there to face the problem, but my kids, your kids, our grandkids will suffer for it. You will surely be wondering then, so what has happened? What happened to us 200 years, 300 years, or whatever time that you want to think about, that we have arrived at this kind of a situation? Who created this monster? And as I reminded you earlier, this is a sentence that is attributed to us often, that caste system is a colonial construction. So what are we saying when we say that? See, to understand this statement, you have to understand something very important. See, European sailors, European traders, European travelers started coming to India as early as 14th century. And they came to India with many stories as background. So the European chronicles told them that the paradise on earth lies somewhere in the east, somewhere where India is. They had heard about a very pious, pure Christian group living in India, led by a very noble king called Prester John. They had heard stories from Greek writers of monsters living here, of noble people living here, of very strange practices like copulating on the roads and eating your dead ones, etc. These kind of stories they came with to India. So India was always an alien land to them, culturally very alien. But if they had to live here, they had to make a habitat out of it. They had to make some kind of livable conditions for themselves. So to say it in very short sentences, they had to make some kinds of heuristics, signposts, maps, cultural and geographical maps, and that's the only way they could have lived. And what happened in the process is that they connected dots which there were no connections earlier, they created dots where there were no dots earlier, and they ended up creating the monster called caste system. And when we say they created caste system, we are not saying what Nicholas Dirk says. The caste system didn't become a reality. The caste system is how S.M. Balangadhar explains, is how Europe experiences India. It's a pattern in their experience of India, and they behaved as though there is something called caste system. They behaved as though caste system is what they are seeing. So it is how they experienced India. And as I've seen over the years, this part of the argument becomes extremely difficult for us to understand. That Europeans came here, they experienced our culture, our society with the background knowledge of their culture, their society, how their society was organized, etc. And they imagine kind of entities that never existed here and they do not exist today. And caste system is one of them. To explain the whole issue, let me use a thought experiment that S.M. Balangadhar often uses in his. Imagine a Martian being comes to Earth and is going around with a notebook and a pen in the hand. It is writing down frantically whatever it sees here and there. It sees one day milk is white, it sees another day that elephants are huge here, it sees another day lions hunt and eat deers, it says another day there's small houses built everywhere. And it has one question: what is here? What is happening on this earth? It just wants to understand all these things. For a period of time, slowly, it comes up with an explanation. It says there is hippocracy on earth, and that explains everything that is happening here. Now, hippocracy becomes not just an explanation for things that are happening, like milk is white and lions are hunting deers, etc. But it also becomes a link between all these things. So everything is happening on earth because there is hippocracy. If you ask questions, what is hippocracy? There is a ready-made answer. You see, don't you see milk is white? Don't you see elephants are so huge? Try to understand what's happening here. The question was asked about hippocracy. The answers were given about empirical entities on earth. There is no way you can deny that elephants are huge compared to some other animals. You cannot deny that milk is white, milk splits, milk becomes dark. So it is the empirical entities that are used as answer to an entity which is not empirical, which is caste system. So it is empirical entities that are used as reference points for understanding something which is not empirical at all, which is hippocracy. A same situation is happening in the caste studies today. European scholars offered caste system as an explanation for everything that they saw in India, everything that they wanted to understand in India. But if you ask today any question about caste system, what is caste system, how does it come into existence, how does it sustain itself, etc., you're always given answers about something or other which is very empirical. They talk about temples, or they talk about some injustice that's happening in some village about drawing water, or they talk about some books. And so what happened then when the Europeans came to India is that they picked and chose many empirical entities, some Sandhya Vandana here, some way of dressing in another part of India, some atrocities in some part of India, and they just draw lines from one to another and created this idea of caste system. That is what, very roughly put, we mean by caste is a colonial construction. What I want to do now in this part of the talk is give you a very historical example to show you how these dots were connected, who connected those dots, and who took it over, etc. And the example I'm talking about is how we as intellectuals have read Greek historical material over last 200 years. See, today if you start reading any textbook, any historical work, any important research work on caste which talks about the origin of caste system and its the way it crystallized in the ancient India, they all refer to one set of material among many other important documents, which is the writings attributed to ancient Greek writers. Ancient Greek writers kept coming to India. Writers, sailors, traders, visitors kept coming to India for almost 1,000 years, starting somewhere in the 6th century BC, before Common Era. And many of them wrote about India. They wrote about Indian society, Indian social practices, Indian strange, so-called strange, or what they thought as strange practices. And these texts are today used as one of the primary material to talk about how caste system existed in Vedic periods, how caste system came into existence and crystallized in the Vedic period. So what I want you to see is how a set of very innocuous documents have become now a kind of foundation for talking about caste in the Vedic period. Just to give you two small examples, see, I'll read out something from Irfan Habib and Romila Thapar. See how they talk about ancient Greek literature. Irfan Habib: Megasthenes, with his listings of 7 castes, make unqualified statements about the formation of the caste system and its supporting ideology. And Romila Thapar: what is evident from Megasthenes' account of Indian society is that the theoretical aspect of the caste system had been fully accepted. Greek and Latin sources, for instance, refer to the caste system in India, and the majority of these references may be traced largely to the account of Megasthenes. Probably when you hear from these important historians talking about how ancient Greek scholars wrote about caste system and its crystallization over the years, you may be thinking that there's a whole lot of writings by Greek writers and they must have explained very in detail about what happened in the 2,300 years ago. Actually not. I started reading all the literature. I don't read Greek, I don't understand Greek language, but I've read them in the 19th century, 20th century translation of those writings. And there is about 3 to 4 pages in all that the Greek writers talk about caste. And it's not even clear to us whether they were talking about caste, because caste is the word that originated somewhere in the 16th century. The standard story goes that it is a word from the Portuguese word called casta. So ancient Greek writers were not writing about caste, they were writing about the divisions in society, some practices that Indians had. So let me first show you what the Greeks were saying, and then I'll tell you how did we read caste into these kind of writings. See, there are 2 important things attributed to Greek writings, which comes in about 4 or 5 pages of writing that I told you, which gets repeated in many different Greek writers. We don't have today original writings written by Megasthenes, for example. What we have today are just snippets quoted here and there by scholars like Arrian and Strabo and others. Therefore, the things that they say about India gets repeated in many different texts. See, there are 2 important things attributed to Greek writers. They talk about 7 divisions of Indian society. Whether it is caste or class depends on who is translating them and which framework you are using. That is not the word that comes from their writings. But the 7 divisions of Indian society read something like this: philosophers, husbandmen, shepherds, artisans, warriors, overseers, and counselors and assessors. That is how they divide Indian society. They think the Indian society had 7 divisions and this is a 7th division. And over the years, in the last 200 years, scholars have used this 7th division of Indian society to say that, see, there was a caste hierarchy in ancient India. See, Megasthenes has seen it. See, Greek scholars have written about it. And they see a hierarchy in this 7th division. For my life, I haven't understood, where do you see a hierarchy in this 7th division? Philosophers are mentioned as the first category. But elsewhere in the text, in fact, twice, Megasthenes calls them the fifth group, or fifth class, or fifth section. And if you talk in terms of privileges, yes, he says the philosophers had a whole lot of privileges, but they are not the privileges of the kind that the last section, the assessors and the counselors had. The assessors and counselors were very close to king, they lived in the palace, etc. That is not how philosophers were treated. But this 7th division of Indian society has been used consistently to talk about the existence of hierarchy in ancient India. And the second important thing attributed to them is a statement about endogamy and some kind of restriction on occupational mobility, exchange of occupations. I'll read out the quotation from a text attributed to Megasthenes, which comes in Arrian's text. The custom of the country prohibits intermarriage between the caste. For instance, the husbandman cannot take a wife from artisan's caste, nor the artisan a wife from husbandman caste. Custom also prohibits anyone from exercising two trades or from changing from one caste to another. One cannot, for instance, become a husbandman if he is a herdsman, or become a herdsman if he is an artisan. It is permitted that the sophists, which is philosophers, only be from any caste, for the life of the sophist is not an easy one, but the hardest of all. And scholars over the years have treated these lines as an indication that the ancient Greek scholars stand witness to two important properties of caste system: endogamy and restrictions on occupational mobility. And here are a couple of important scholars for you who say these things. First one is from B.R. Ambedkar. He says, Megasthenes did feel that the social organization of the Hindus was of a very strange sort. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken such particular care to describe the peculiar features of the Hindu social organization. Bernard S. Cohn says, Megasthenes also noted that each of these 7 classes were endogamous and that one couldn't change his occupation or profession. M. N. Srinivas, Andre Bataille, and the co-authors say, the first foreigner to record his comments about caste was Megasthenes, a Greek who as early as the 4th century BC remarked on the way in which caste restricted the choice of a spouse and of an occupation. There are 3 important questions that we should ask. How did they decide that the word philosophers or sophist refers to Brahmins? How did they decide, these scholars in the 19th and 20th century? Second one, do really Greek scholars say that only philosophers, that is Brahmins according to the 19th century and 20th century scholars, enjoy this privilege and nobody else enjoys this privilege? Where did this idea come from? So that brings us to the question of what Greek scholars call a philosopher's privilege. They say that it is true that they say that philosophers can marry outside of their group. It is true that they say philosophers can have any job if they want. But they say something very interesting. They say philosophers can do this because of their excellence, because of their virtue, because they live a very difficult, hard life. So, interesting part of it is this. We have to understand now what is this excellence, virtue, the difficult life that these Greek scholars are talking about, which philosophers are attributed with. What is this virtuous life or life of excellence? What do they mean by this? Over the last few decades, many scholars have pointed out that the word virtue doesn't really, the way the Greek scholars use it, doesn't really mean what the Christians later used it as some kind of being nice, being benevolent, being very kind, etc. So virtue in ancient Greek literature meant completely different. It stood for some kind of life that people lived. It's a kind of excellence in the sense that if somebody is stands out from the group, if somebody is superior in terms of strength or learning, etc., that person is a virtuous person. That person's life is a life of excellence. So you can say in a way that when Greek scholars, Greek writers, or Greek philosophers using virtue or virtuous life, they are saying something what we would here in India be referring to as a life of a guru, a life of a rishi, a life of a sannyasi. They live a very hard life, they stand apart from ordinary human beings, and see, you can do it as an exercise. Go back to Greek literature and find out how they described the life of philosophers. They talk about philosophers' life as difficult because of austerity. Most of them live naked. They don't care about the wealth of the world. They don't think about name and fame. They eat very little. They practice very rigorous life. For example, one of the things that the philosophers, as they are called Brahmins now, their duty is to predict when the rain will come, for example. And if a philosopher, the prediction does not come true 3 times in a row, then that Brahmin or that philosopher is asked to keep quiet for the rest of his life apparently. That's what Megasthenes says. So this is how they understood a life of a philosopher. They lived a life which we today associate with, in our stories at least, with old rishis and gurus and somebody who is excelled in adhyatma. So that is how they understood philosopher. And the other interesting thing that Greek scholars write about these philosophers is a philosopher can come from any caste, which means what? It means any person belonging to any caste. Well, I'm using the word caste, that's because I'm reading the 19th century translation where every Greek word has been rendered into caste and class. But basically Greek scholars are saying that a philosopher can come from any section, which means everybody, if they could live a virtuous life, virtue as the Greeks were using the word, they could have become a philosopher. Once you become a philosopher, you could have married anybody. And when I say these things, don't assume that by philosopher they mean referred only to men. No, they also talk about women. So even a woman could have become a philosopher, could have come from any section of the society, and once she becomes a philosopher, she could have married anybody. So where is the hierarchy here? Where is the endogamy that we talk about here? Where is the restriction on occupational mobility that we talk about here? So now obviously the next question is, how did scholars manage to find caste system where there was no caste system? How did they manage to see a hierarchy and endogamy and all kinds of things in this 4 or 5 pages of writings attributed to ancient Greek scholars? And the credit goes to one of the very important 19th century scholar called Thomas Colebrooke, who is considered the first most important Sanskrit scholar to come from Europe. In 1807, he wrote an article on Jains. In fact, he coined the word Jains today, which becomes so popular, is a word that he coined in 1807 article. So in this article, for the first time, he showed that we can reconcile, we can match what the Greeks are saying with the then understanding of caste system, which had a hierarchy, which had endogamy restrictions, etc. And he spends about 10 pages in that article. It's a lengthy article, 10 pages of that article just to show how to undertake this exercise. He takes line by line from the Megasthenes, Arian and other scholars and shows, see, you can read caste into it. See, you can read caste into it. So it's important for us to understand now, what did he do? How did he do it? To understand what he did, you have to first know something important. Ancient Greek scholars, when they talk about philosophers, they divide philosophers into 2 and sometimes 3 groups. One is called Brachmans, another one is called Sermones, and Strabo adds a third group of philosophers called Pramanes. Difficult Greek words to pronounce. The interesting observation comes from Bardesian, a Syriac writer of 2nd century of the Common Era. He says becoming a Brahman is a birthright, but one can choose to become, if they want, a Samanena. There are very interesting ways of interpreting it. You can say even if being a philosopher is something related to your birth, there is another way of becoming a philosopher. You can become a philosopher by living a particular kind of life. But Colebrook takes the discussion into a completely different direction. It goes through a very complicated argument to show that, see, these Brahmins that the Europeans are, the ancient Greeks are talking about are actually Brahmins, and the Samanas that they are talking about are Buddhist, Jain and other monks, and you could never have become a Brahmin because being a Brahmin is about your birth, but you could have become a Buddhist or a Jain monk by choice. Question is, how did you arrive at this kind of reading? And it's very funny the way it is. He uses about 3 arguments to make this important jump from that Brahmins are Brahmins and Samanas are Shramanas. First one probably is easy to understand for you. Brahmins phonetically sounds similar to Brahmanas, so Brahmins are Brahmanas, and Samanas sounds phonetically similar to Shramanas, therefore Shramanas are Buddhist and Jain monks. That is one. Second argument that he uses is, in the Greek description, Brahmins are always sun worshippers, but Samanas are not. And in his own research, apparently at that time he had found out that only Brahmins do sun worship and not Buddhists and Jains. Therefore, the distinction of Brahmins and Samanas must be a distinction between Brahmins versus Buddhist and Jain monks. Actually, it is not true that Buddhists and Jains are also sun worshippers in some contexts, and but it is a 19th century argument. There is a third argument that Colebrook uses in his argument, which is, see, there is a scholar called Strabo. He is a very important Greek scholar. He says in the passing somewhere that this third category of philosophers called Brahmane were very critical of Brahmanas. They always criticize them for the rituals. So that argument, that lines become the clinching deal for Colebrook. Oh yes, Brahmins were always indulged in all kinds of nasty things, and here are Buddhist and Jain monks who are criticizing Brahmins for the rituals. So therefore the distinction between Brahmins and Samanas must be the distinction between Brahmins and Buddhist, Jains and other monks. But there's a problem there, right? It's the Brahmane. The Brahmane and Brahmane now cannot be distinguished phonetically, at least, as Brahmins and Shramanas. But in 1846, in one of his writings, an important writer solves this problem. It's called Schwanbeck, and he first translated Megasthenes, the snippets and fragments attributed to Megasthenes, into Latin. It is with the Schwanbeck's edition in 1846 that Megasthenes comes into the academic field, becomes very popular in the academic field. He does something even more funny. Colebrook had used phonetic similarity between Brahmins and Shramanas to make them Brahmins and Shramanas, but there is a Strabo's Brahmane which is left out of the thing. There is still sticking out. So Schwanbeck proposes an interesting argument. He says, when you write in Greek letters, I can only show you that and you will understand what happens. What he does is, he says, see, Shramana, when you write in Greek, the first letter, it looks like E written a little bit awkwardly. And the Brahmanes, the word, the sound per in Greek letter, when you write it, it looks like a reversed 7. He says, see, every time the E was written, it was read as P, or P was written, it was read as E, and it is not the mistake of Greek scholars, it is the mistake of the later copywriters. So everywhere there was an E, that's how it looks like the Greek letter, they read it as P, or the P was read like E, and therefore the confusion comes. So we should now just give up the word Brahmanes we should stick with the word Shramanes, and it is all that only distinction worth talking about is Shramanas versus Brahmanas, and that's how he solves the problem. So the entire Greek literature, in a matter of about 2 writers writing of 20 years duration, they turn it into a caste literature which is talking about Brahmins versus Buddhists and Jain monks. And this story went on to become the standard story of how Greek scholars prove that the caste system existed 2,300 years ago. And the Indian scholars, I won't go into the things that they have said over the next 50, 80, 100 years. They just take it as though that is the word which has come from the mouth of the god. And to give you one example, in 1920s, writing about this literature, an Indian scholar called Vaidya, he says, Megasthenes remarks that the Brahmins were allowed to marry wives from the lower castes. Only Brahmins were allowed to marry wives from the lower caste. This is what Vaidya says. So we went from we took a European argument which Colebrook himself in his 1807 article kept on saying that he is just proposing a tentative argument. He is not sure that this is a valid argument, but he wants to talk about it here in that article. Remember, the article was about Jains, not about Greek and caste system. But in the passing, he makes this tentative claim, which he himself says is not a well-argued argument, but it becomes the standard argument, and we took it over. And I'll give you one more example from a very important 20th century Indian writer. The way she reads Megasthenes after almost 100 years after, 120 years after, 150 years after Colebrook, and you see for yourself what she does with it. And I'm referring to Romila Thappas, a little longish quotation. It's about 2 paragraphs long. And on your screen you will see that the quotation has many letters and numbers written in square brackets, parentheses. That is to show you that she takes 2 to 3 facts which are all marked in numeral English letters A, B, A to D, and she adds about another 13 imaginary situations, imaginary arguments to make an argument out of it. Megasthenes states that Indian society was divided into 7 classes. These he lists as philosophers, farmers, soldiers, herdsmen, artisans, magistrates, and councillors. Aryan states that there are about 7. This is Romila Thappas speaking, and she starts with a fact, which is this is what the Greek writers say. Then she adds the first hypothesis from her side. But these Greek writers like Aryan, does not speak with certainty. I am not sure how she found out that they are not speaking with certainty. This observation of Megasthenes is only partially based on fact. That it's a repetition of the earlier statement is one thing, but she is adding it. Just see that. The idea of society being divided into groups was no doubt a prevalent one. That's true. But now see what she adds to it. And the system must have been explained to him by local Brahmins. So local Brahmins were standing there and explaining to the Greek writers who came in thousands of numbers. They were talking about caste system and explaining and hiding the caste system basically. But the number of classes and the categories must have become confused in his mind. That's Megasthenes or Aryan's mind. His divisions appear to have been rather economic divisions than social. This is understandable because the system of the 4 varnas or caste originated in an economic division. That's her theory. And it is possible that the vestiges of this origin remained in Mauryan times. It is obvious that the division of Megasthenes couldn't follow rules of endogamy and restrict themselves to their own trade. He appears to have confused his own observations with Brahminical theory. Megasthenes and Aryan must have confused their own observations with the theory of Brahmins. The numerical confusion may be due to the fact that in writing his account, possibly some years after his visit to India, he may have accidentally arrived in the number 7, forgetting the facts as given to him. We must also keep in mind that the fragments remaining to us are not the original accounts but are quotations from the original. That is true. Here is another fact. Some of the inconsistencies may be explained by erroneous quoting on the part of later authors. Megasthenes may also have had in mind the description of Egyptian society as given by Herodotus, who enumerates 7 social classes in Egypt. As you can see on the screen, that she adds about 13 imagined scenarios to it, which are, some of them are so funny that Bhavin standing in the corner and telling the stories to Megasthenes and Arion. Megasthenes and Arion forgot the numbers because they wrote about it after going back. So this is what we have done with the colonial writings of the 19th century. And we think today we have understood caste system. We think the caste system exists and we have enough material to show this. You should ask yourself, what are we doing with this 19th century arguments? To go back to an argument that I had earlier made, an argument that comes from S.N. Balangadhar, that the caste system is a social construct, the caste system is a European construction. See, there is one thing very important that I didn't mention earlier. If caste system is a social construction in the way I explained to you, that it is the Europeans, the pattern in the way Europeans experienced Indian culture, it will never be available to Indians. Indians will never understand European experience. So all that Indians can do with the caste studies, with the caste system arguments, is what Rumila Thapar is doing here. Take up 2 lines from the European scholars of the 19th century and add a huge story to it and a lot of slogans and emotions to it, and there you are with the caste system story. So this is what is happening in caste system studies. So what is the moral of the story, the story that I told you so far? I'll be very brief again. I'll tell just 2 things. In 1807, when Colebrooke was writing, the India's GDP in terms of PPP, purchase power parity, was about 3 times more than UK. By the time when Rumila Thapar was writing in 1960s, India had become the most poor third world country, and UK's GDP had gone about 2.5 times more than India's. So the story is not just a story of how we have constructed caste system story over the years, picking it up from Europeans which we don't understand, but it is also a story of what we have lost in the process. So we were better than UK when the story began. When the story ended in our hands, we are one of the poorest countries. But that is nothing compared to what we lost, which is my second point. In 200 years, in 300 years, what my teacher S.N. Balangadhar says is that we have lost access to our experience. Today, the kind of things that we are saying about Indian society, caste system, about our own people, about our traditions and culture are not what we experience, are not part of our experience. This is how Europeans experienced it. So where does that leave us? Let me go back to the argument that I made so far and summarize so that we see what we have said so far. As I keep telling my students after the class, if you didn't understand what I said about Europeans coming to India, if you didn't understand what I meant by caste as a colonial construction or caste as a European construction, forget it. If you didn't understand whatever I said about Greeks, forget that also. There is just one important point that you have to understand today. That is, this field of caste studies is full of confusions, enormous amount of confusions. we think we know what we are talking about when we talk about caste system, caste atrocities, caste problems, etc. But trust me, we don't know. When I started writing about caste, doing my research about caste about 12, 15 years ago, one of the biggest challenges I had was this. Where do slogans stop and my empirically rich and conceptually sound arguments begin in my understanding of caste system was very difficult for me to understand. That I think caste system exists is just a slogan. That I think caste system is unjust was just a slogan. The moment I started digging into the empirical facts, empirical information that can support these arguments, I realized that there is hardly anything to support these slogans. If you think caste atrocities is full of very sound data, then you should just go back to the book that I mentioned earlier, Western Foundations of the Caste System, and we have enough information given there to show you that when we talk about caste atrocities, we give one-sided data. The data is skewed and the data is wrong. So, what you can take home from this talk is simply this. The amount of confusions that this caste studies has today is not just about some historical confusions, some conceptual problems here and there. No. These problems are creating huge amount of problems in society today. We use these faulty theories in understanding ourselves. We use these wrong arguments to create solutions for non-existent problems in Indian society today. To give you a metaphor from medicine, the problem is like somebody has met with an accident and has a huge wound on the skin, and we are giving chemotherapy to cure the wound. So you should know that chemotherapy kills the cells. It doesn't help a wound to cure. So that is what's happening with caste system issues today. So non-existent problems are cropping up, and instead of solving problems in the last 100 years, we have created more problems. So the challenge before us, before me and before you, the audience, is to start thinking about these issues afresh, to start thinking about the problems that we have, which caste system has failed to understand and solve so far in 100 years. We have to go back to them and re-understand them, re-study them, and come up with new ideas. We are working on these issues sitting in a corner of Karnataka in India, South India. So why don't you join us? We can work together. This is not an academic issue anymore. It is an issue about how we think about ourselves, how we present ourselves to the world, and how the world is treating us. Thank you.